So just for the information, the presentations will be recorded in order to upload for the YouTube as per the ACT guidelines, sir.
Sure, sure, ma'am. Yeah, no
Okay, sir.
issues.
Okay. Now we'll begin with our second session of the day. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Deepak Keti. A brief introduction of the speaker, Deepak Keti. So he's working as an assistant professor in the Department of Electronics and Communication Engineering at Indian Institute of Information Technology, Dharwad. He completed his PhD in Electronics and Electrical Engineering Department from Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati in the year 2016. His thesis is titled Foreground Speech Segmentation and Enhancement under the supervision of Professor S.R.M. Prasanna. He received the Bachelor of Engineering degree in Instrumentation Technology from Malnad College of Engineering, University of Mysore, Hassan, India, in the year 1999, and Master of Technology degree in Biomedical Instrumentation from Sri Chamarajendra College of Engineering, Mysuru, Vishweshwara Technology University, Mysuru, India, in the year 2002. Prior to this job, he has worked as a technical leader at Nextpro Semiconductor, Bangalore, from the year 2016 to 2017. He worked as a senior project engineer in ST Microelectronics, Bangalore, from the year 2005 to 2010, mainly focusing on audio post-processing algorithms for digital television groups. We welcome you for this workshop, sir. Over to you, Deepak sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for the kind introduction. I would like to thank you and also Professor Harish. And it's a privilege always to give a talk in my in my own institute, SJC. That's where I studied MTech, as you rightly said. So now I'm working as an assistant professor at IIIT Dharwad. So there is always a confusion. There's Indian Institute of Technology as well in Dharwad. So both these institutes are located here in Dharwad. So today's talk, I thought like I'll talk on convolutional neural networks. Deep learning per se, like it's a vast topic. There are several algorithms as such. The intention of this talk is to introduce you people to the area of deep learning and get into little details about the convolutional neural network itself. Though it's not possible to cover the entire aspect of convolutional neural network in 1.5 hours, but I'll take you through some of the conceptual understanding of this convolutional neural network. And also I'll take you through some of the important blocks that are involved in designing the convolutional neural network. And of course, I may not be able to delve into backpropagation algorithm due to the short of time. And I'll also give you links and let you know how to realize the convolutional neural networks using Keras platform. So I'll take you through the code as well. So this is the objective of today's session. Some of the books I've referred to prepare this presentation goes like this. And not only for this particular presentation, but these books are really handy and they have dealt the subject in a very fundamental manner as well in a practical approach as well. So these are some of the textbooks, what I recommend you people to study in case like you people are getting into this deep learning domain or artificial neural networks for that matter. Yeah, Artificial Neural Networks by Professor B. Yagnanarayana. So is one of the very good books that are there, and he has dealt fundamentally almost all of the algorithms that we essentially deal today as deep learning. Then Fundamentals of Neural Networks, Network Architecture, Algorithms and Applications by Lauren Fawcett is another very good book. Certainly you people have to go through these books in order to get the fundamental aspects of the neural networks. Then Simon Hyken is also a very good book to refer. That is Neural Networks, A Comprehensive Foundation by Simon Hyken. Then the pattern classification by Duda Hart. So it's one of the most classic books as far as machine learning and pattern recognitions are concerned. Certainly, you people have to refer that book as well. It's a well-written book to understand the concepts of what is pattern recognition is all about. Then Neural Networks and Deep Learning by Charu C. Agarwal is another good book, especially how that neural network literature is linked to deep learning and how we are able to attain deeper layers in the neural nets. And essentially that leads to many interesting algorithms and applications. So that is well written by Charu C. Agarwal. So it's another book worth referring to. And Deep Learning by Ian Goodfellow, Yoshua Bengio is another good book to refer. So these are some of the books that you people can refer for deep learning literature. And some of the YouTube links that I've referred to prepare this presentation. So one is what do we mean by action potential of a neuron is. So this is the link that I've referred. And the brain neural net, in case if we are interested to know how they actually work. So this is one good link. And regarding the visual cortex, because mostly now in this session, we are interested to deal with the computer vision. So visual cortex is one of the important part of a brain which essentially deals with the visual aspects. So that's one good link to refer. Then comes the edge detectors and orientation of the visual cortex. Again, the link has been provided. And one more good link to refer for deep learning is the series of video lectures given by Andrew Ng. There is specific video link as far as convolutional neural networks is concerned. So that is also there in this particular link what I've provided. Then there's a good introductory course on deep learning by MIT. So this is another good link to refer. So here I've provided you the literature that I've referred to prepare this presentation. You can as well go and look into these literature in detail to get deeper understanding of deep learning and other algorithms. In fact, the literature can be dated back to 1940s. So it has almost taken a good 6 to 7 decades to mature itself as a field. Now, by default, when we say artificial intelligence problem, and if we have enough data at our disposal, most likely I tend to apply these deep learning algorithms to solve those artificial intelligence problems. So it has become so synonymous that so it is meant to be deep learning. That's not the case. Deep learning is one of the approach to solve the artificial intelligence problems. In fact, the earliest days were all rule-based, algorithmic-based, step-based approaches. Then eventually, off late, most of these AI problems are tackled using these deep learning algorithms because of the inherent advantages these deep learning algorithms has. Say, for instance, wherein all these deep learning algorithms are applied, no such field that is untouched by these deep learning algorithms nowadays, except for those domains where we don't have significant amount of data. Rest all other cases, rest all other applications where we have a significantly large amount of data. So then deep learning by default is the algorithm through which we can solve these AI problems. So for instance, now 3.7 seconds of somebody's voice is good enough to replicate his voice. So I can clone his voice. So that robust the deep learning algorithms have got into. and some of the games like chess, Chinese checker. So they're they're all able to we all able to solve or crack those games better than synthesis or face generation has become so natural now. It's hard to humans to distinguish whether the images have been generated by algorithms or do they exist on earth. So especially when it comes to generative adversarial networks or GAN networks, they've become so sophisticated, so they can almost synthesize human faces as natural as they exist. So such is the sophistication of these applications, be it Siri or Google Voice, so IBM Voice. So all those are again internally dealing with the deep learning algorithms. There are different algorithms to deal with different applications, of course. Then medical applications. So almost like these algorithms have come to a state where they've started outperforming the humans' performance. When I say humans' performance, we have to take a note of caution. The applications will be very, very narrow and be very specific, unlike what we humans can do. We can deal with all sorts of data, be it fuzzy, or be it like noisy, or be it twisted, be it rotated, be it flipped. So we can take any such sort of data, whereas these uh, way of inputting the data. So that's one of the problems that are associated. And all these algorithms, one of the big challenges in front of research community is how do we design the algorithms which can take less amount of data and perform to a similar the extent of improvement that we have attained using these deep learning. And this is how broadly 3 different sets of things can be looked into and terminologies. Nevertheless, we should, as a researchers and being academicians, we should be knowing the fine difference between all these. Artificial
Deepak sir? Sure.
Hello.
Hello. So Deepak sir, slides has not been visible, sir.
Are you able to see this? Sorry. Hello.
No, not it, sir. No slides has been presented, sir, here.
All this while. Okay. Let me just. Yeah. Let me just present. So all these while the slides were not present, is it?
As soon as you start with the third slide from then, sir.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Is that visible now, ma'am?
Yes, sir. And so slide number 5, sir. Yes, sir.
So-
From here, as soon as you started
Yeah,
it, voice got breaks.
still I'm in third slide.
Yes.
Yeah.
So your voice
Ma'am?
is breaking.
Voice is on slide number 5, is it?
Yes, sir.
This is
No,
the
so
slide to
five,
my
slide number
voice.
5.
So these are some of the applications that deep learning domain. So there are, just a sec. Is slide number 5? Yeah. Yeah, this is the slide, right? Yeah. So voice is audible, ma'am?
Voice is
Is it
audible,
audible?
sir, but slides is not been.
Hello?
Voice is audible, sir. Yes, sir. Slides also is visible. Google Meet को क्या होता
Yeah. Is it visible now, ma'am?
है? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes,
Is
sir.
it
Yes,
is it
sir.
visible? Sorry.
अरे
Hello.
yes.
Yeah. Now the voice is visible, ma'am. Yeah.
We can hear you properly, sir. It's
Yeah.
very
Fine.
clear
Okay.
now, but and slides is
Okay.
not visible, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just share them. Is it
Yes,
visible
sir.
now, ma'am?
Yes, sir. Slides are.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. 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 Is it visible? Sorry.
Black. Yes, sir. Yes,
Hello.
sir. You can start from slide number 5, sir. All this were over.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. This
You
all
can start from slide number 5, sir. These were
also is over.
very clearly audible. Yes, sir.
Hello.
Sir? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Fine. Okay. So I was talking about these three different domains that we have basically. And another one being the deep learning. And there are, hello, yeah. Is it audible, ma'am? Sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can. Now it's audible, sir. It's clear, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir. It is audible. It's
Rupa,
audible,
ma'am,
sir.
let me know.
Yes, sir.
Connection ಇಲ್ಲ. Hello.
Sir, tell me, sir.
Yeah, is it audible, ma'am, now? Yeah. And
It's
also
audible,
visible?
sir. Yes, sir. Uh,
Yeah.
yes, sir. It is perfect, sir, now.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for the glitch. Like I have issues with the network. Bear with me. Yeah. So there are three fine differences as far as these definitions are concerned. One is the AI, machine learning, and deep learning. The approaches, the AI has been dynamic in its definition, starting from the very calculator, which almost intrigued its ability, to some of the most sophisticated human behavioral or human intelligent systems, like say, for instance, speech, NLP, computer vision. So all the definition has been changing or as the technology is evolving and also the algorithms are evolving. So machine learning set of algorithms per se is by the definition of solving these AI problems. But here the motivation is not necessarily from the human brain or animal brain for that matter. Whereas when it comes to artificial neural networks and deep learning, here the very motivation is the human brain or the animal brain. So it's the brain neural network which is the motivation to solve these AI problems. So there are broadly now, at least at this juncture of time, mostly we rely on data driven techniques. mostly we tend to solve these AI problems using machine learning and deep learning. That has become the norm of the day, but there were other ways of solving these AI problems in the early days as well. So it didn't happen just by these set of algorithms or the literature that is there in the scientific domain. But apart from these algorithms, there are other ingredients which has made it possible for us to solve these difficult problems to an extent. Say, for instance, the literature started with the stochastic gradient descent in the 1950 and the perceptron learning law that was proposed in the year 1958 and backpropagation algorithm in the year 1986. Then the deep convolutional neural nets to begin with. So these were some of the scientific literature that we can find starting from early 1940s onwards. So then the neural networks dates not only the set of algorithms, but also the huge amount of data that is that is at our disposal to develop these applications. Say, for instance, ImageNet, which is a competition, which is an annual competition, and it is organized yearly once. And a lot of data is all thrown as a challenge, and people can come up with their own novel ways of solving these classification problem, or even labeling, or giving a text to the computer vision. So likewise, we have a lot of databases in other domains as well. So which is very much available. Kaggle is one of the websites that we can always refer to, wherein we have a lot of data repositories to begin our experiments with the deep learning. Then apart from that, there's a big improvement as far as the hardware is concerned. So the deep learning were only confined to a few big corporate companies which could afford the costly servers. But now things are democratized due to the finding of that GPUs were very efficient in implementing these deep learning algorithms. So graphics processing unit based cards. So if we have a decent 3 to 5 lakhs, so we can have one GPU based machine, and we can run deep learning based algorithms there. So that is as far as the hardware is concerned. In fact, it has gone beyond the GPU cards. In fact, like Intel Movidium has introduced a small chip which can be just held on a fingertip. It's so small, so we can compact the devices for these deep learning applications. So we can embed those ICs for especially calculating the decoding or testing of a given data. It's quite easy now to do that. And that's how the technology is progressing as well. Coming to software, there's a big improvement in terms of software tools available to develop these algorithms. So some of them to name is TensorFlow. Of course, it's a set of libraries dedicated for development of deep neural network algorithms. And there are toolboxes, especially say MATLAB toolboxes, or many such software toolboxes have come into picture, and linear algebra packages like NumPy, SciPy. So they're all at our disposal. Now, as a combination of all these different things, now we have come to a point wherein we are able to tackle intelligent problems that especially were confined to humans or animals. Now it has come to a time in a very specific way that we can deploy these algorithms to solve those human intelligent tasks, basically. So in fact, convolutional neural nets, when they were applied for these ImageNet challenges, the error rate of this classification drastically reduced from the year 2012 onwards. We can see a big difference in the error reduction. So to an extent, in the year 2011, the error rate was somewhere in the 25%. That came down to 16% in the year 2012. Thanks to the first convolutional neural net called as AlexNet. And to begin with, it had 8 deeper layers and 61 million parameters. From the year 2012, it has been a watershed moment for deep learning algorithms. Till then, the deep learning algorithms were not in limelight. So in fact, machine learning algorithms were the one which actually were ruling the market. So from post the 2012, the deep learning algorithms has come to limelight. So every year we can see that the number of layers has exponentially increased due to different reasons, as I stated in the earlier slide. And as of 2015, the residual net has 152 different deeper layers. So now we can imagine the complexity of these algorithms and the number of parameters that needs to be tuned as far as this algorithm. In fact, like in the year 2015, they almost boldly stated that for a given specific task of image classification, these algorithms were able to outbeat the humans' performance. Humans' error rate somewhere stands out, say 5, whereas the algorithm's performance is standing somewhere in the fact of 3.57. So that's the remarkable ability of these algorithms. Only drawback, what I notice is that we require specialized hardware units in order to handle these algorithms, and we require large amount of data sets in order to utilize the strength of these algorithms. So except for those drawbacks, which applications can afford these things, then certainly we can switch to deep learning algorithms. So now, having understood its significance, now let's get to know what is convolutional neural networks in specific is. So convolutional neural nets, or in short, like they're called as CNNs in the literature, especially are meant to handle the grid structured data. So when it comes to grid structured data, there's a strong spatial dependencies. So that means there's a high degree of correlation amongst the different points of data that we have in the grid. So one of the obvious example for a grid structured data is a two-dimensional image. So that's what we'll take up in this course, and let's learn like how these CNNs work on those two-dimensional image. That's what our point of interest is. Then they exhibit a lot of spatial dependencies. If they didn't have the spatial dependency, even we could have not recognized the image. So essentially these CNNs make use of these spatial dependencies in order to solve the given problem. So then when it comes to colored images, no more it's a two-dimensional spatial image. It becomes a three-dimensional input volume. Why? Because the colored image is made up of R, G, and B, which are the basic units through which we can synthesize different colors possible. So there will be 3 dedicated matrices, which is in the two-dimensional form, in order to represent this given image. Henceforth, it's no more a two-dimensional space, whereas now it has become a three-dimensional input volume. That's the kind of data that we deal when we talk about the colored images. So one of the important properties of these visual images are such that they are translational invariant. In a sense, you shift the object from one position to another position, or you flip it, you rotate it. So it has no impact on classifying the image. So that's what we especially do when the images are flipped or when the images are shifted. We simply don't have any issues to recognize those particular objects. So that's one of the inherent characteristics of these visual images. So convolutional neural networks also create similar feature values from local regions with similar patterns. So it requires this kind of pattern in order to recognize or classify the given image. So one advantage of image data is that the effects of specific inputs on feature representations can always be thought in an intuitive fashion. By looking at the image, we can get to know where are the edges are. So what kind of background it has. So what color that particular object or that particular segment has. So we can easily attribute all these facts to the entire image that has been formed. So very similarly, the convolutional neural nets also utilizes these features at different levels in order to solve the problem. So one of the important defining characteristic of a convolutional neural net is that like it utilizes convolution as its basic algorithm, and henceforth the name the convolution has come in this network. Let's try to understand the CNN's historical perspective. In fact, like CNNs is one of the first success stories as far as deep learning literature is concerned. So as I told, the ImageNet classification problem started in the year 2011. I mean, there were competition. From 2011, the convolutional neural net architecture started dominating the competition. That's when people realized the strength of these deep learning. So that strength percolated to different fields and domains, and that's the story now what we speak. So coming to CNNs, most essentially they deal with hierarchical feature engineering. So all these while, before the advent of these CNNs, people were struggling in the conventional sense to extract relevant features so they could feed it to the classification algorithms, especially driven by the machine learning algorithms. But off late, with the introduction of the CNNs, the headache of like what feature to be extracted in what fashion to be extracted for a given application is all lying on the shoulder of a algorithm itself. So henceforth, such networks are also called as end-to-end networks. So you need not do anything with the data. You just can afford to feed the data in its raw form to the networks, and networks in turn takes care of extracting the features and classifying it or labeling it or do whatever the applications you desire. So that's one of the advantages of these neural networks. And this is one of the classical example where the biological neural net has literally inspired the evolution of this algorithm. Let's see how this evolution of this CNNs have taken place in the literature. It's quite interesting to know the fact how they could draw the cues from the biological visual system to the machine visual system. So that's what it has come to now. So talking about the visual system, so we know the objects are formed through eye, and essentially the eye consists of sclera, cornea, iris, and at the back of it like lies the retina. Retina is where all our fundamental visual receptors are there, called as rods and cone cells. And the integrated information from these receptors is all communicated to the nerve fiber. The nerve fiber, which actually gets linked to different parts of the brain, actually it runs to thalamus, and then in turn it gets connected to the visual cortex. Visual cortex, the neurons in the visual cortex are the one which actually processes this visual information and help us to find out what is that object is, how far it is, what is the color combination of those objects. So all those different things. So this is in short like how our visual system looks like, and this is how it works. So in fact, one of the earliest motivation for these convolutional neural networks is the experiments studied by Hubel and Wiesel on a cat's visual cortex. The visual cortex is a small region of cells that are sensitive to specific regions in the visual field. So if specific areas of that visual field in the retinal area, then certain specific cells gets excited. Not only that, there are certain cells which are dedicated to certain shape and orientation. Only that shape and orientation can cause those specific cells to be excited. So this was one of the remarkable studies that happened thanks to Hubel and Wiesel. They actually did all these experiments and took the pain to actually show us how exactly our brain identifies the shape and orientation. In fact, those were the preliminary studies that were conducted in the 1950s, to be precise. So this is how it works. Like I was talking about the optic nerve, then there's an optical lens, then retina is where the nerve fiber runs, and they crisscross to left and right hemisphere of the brain. The crossover point is called as optic chiasma, and it gets connected to the lateral geniculate nucleus. From that, it gets connected to nerve fiber, gets connected to the primary visual cortex. This is where the objects do get deciphered. So the shape, the color, and all those things gets deciphered at this part of the brain, that is primary visual cortex. Now, how those happens? Basically, the primary element of this processing is called as neuron. Neuron, in turn, it contains a branch or tree-like structure called dendrites. So these dendrites, in turn, gets connected to thousands of other neurons, and center to that cell lies the nucleus. And there is something called as axon, which is a fiber that helps the conduction of that signal from that cell body to the axon terminal, or that's where the synaptic junction lies, and in turn gets connected to several thousands of neurons. So how this signal gets transmitted and assimilated? So we can broadly or crudely say that there's a several set of inputs that the cell body receives, and the cell body integrates all that information. Integration crudely can be thought as summation block as far as neural network is concerned. So it integrates all that information. The integrated information is all transmitted to the next set of neurons connected to this. So that happens through axon. The flow of information with reference to neuron happens using chemical transmission. In fact, to be specific, the sodium chloride and potassium ions are involved in transmission of these signals. Whereas at the junction of those neurons, it's the neurotransmitters which helps us to transmit the signal from one end to another end. If at all we want to relate it to our digital phenomena, then we can regard this cell or neuron, one single neuron, either it fires or it doesn't fire. And there's a whole theory behind it when this firing or no firing happens, which I'll not get into those details. Now we can think of the brain as a complex network of these neurons, which helps us to solve these intelligent tasks, these human behaviors or animal behaviors, for instance. So keeping this as a cue, these two people, the kind of lab setup they had, with that kind of lab, they were still able to crack how does a brain works, especially with reference to vision. So that was in the year 1960s. So this was the very paper that was published in the year 1959. So it's a very good paper. Always I suggest you people to refer the original papers because the kind of discussion that happens in those original papers can only be found in those first papers, because rest all other papers dilutes the information. And it's quite obvious that since they quote it as a reference, always it's a good habit to go back to those original papers and refer to those works. This is one of the classical work as far as cat's visual cortex was concerned. So this is how the setup was. They found out that you can see that the cat is made stationary, and the visual stimulus of certain orientation is all triggered as a stimulus for this vision system. And the brain neuron in turn responds to the stimuli. How to record that stimuli? It's that like we can put an electrode to a single neuron and record its activity against that of a stimulus. So what they found out was not all cells will be responding equally to all orientations of those stimulations. Stimulations of vertical cells may not respond to horizontal stimulation. Likewise, the angled one. So different intensities. So depending on how close that pattern is to the response. So that's how these brain neurons actually functions. So keeping this as a motive, they sort of explained how the neurons actually work in tandem with the visual receptors to find the patterns in the object. So for that, they got a Nobel Prize in the year 1981. In fact, Hubel and Wiesel both shared that Nobel Prize in the year 1981, especially for helping us to understand the information processing that happens in the visual system. So thanks to these people. As a motivation of this, Professor Fukushima, they came up with the first neural network with reference to this visual system called as neocognitron. That is in the year 1980s. So this is when the first paper of the visual neural network was proposed, and it was called as neocognitron. Even to this date, the principles, the basic principles remain same as it was published in neocognitron in the year 1980s. Let's see and little understand of what was this neocognitron was all about and how it was related to the cat's visual cortex. So that was the motive with which they proposed this neocognitron. So this is how the fundamental architecture of a neocognitron looked like, basically. So it had an input layer, basically, that feeds in the information that what object or what visual information that we are supposed to process. That layer is called as the input layer, and there are a lot of connections. So as we saw, the brain network is all about the connections. Here also they dealt with a lot of the connections to the next layer, and subsequently the next layer, and subsequently the last layer, which acts like an output layer. So as our visual cortex cells are also hierarchical in deriving the information, this network was also arranged in a fashion to derive a similar motivation, that we could solve these visual problems by extracting the features in an hierarchical fashion. So the very next layer, for instance, this layer takes different connections, and these different connections will have different weightages depending on what pattern of input is feeding to the next layer. So likewise, from this layer, then subsequently it gets connected to next layer, and subsequently it gets connected to the output layer. So this pattern A will reinforce certain connections. What do we mean by reinforcement of connections? So it strengthens those connections, and that's how typically our brain also works. So there is strengthening of certain connections, and altogether there is disconnection of different connections, depending on what task that particular region of the brain is performing. Likewise, we can see that, and the two intermediate layers in the neural network terminology is called as the hidden layer. The two extreme layers, one to the left is called as input, and right extreme is called as the output layer. So likewise, a different pattern in the input trigger different sort of connections, and this reinforcement or the strength of connection is all governed by the weights with which these layers gets connected. So that's the importance of the weights. So these weights are the one which we can tune as far as our neural network training is concerned. So by training with reference to these neural network weights, the network learns the specific patterns. And mind it, our brain always processes the data in terms of pattern. Never we handle the pattern as a data. Whereas for machine, it's a different thing. We try to figure out the patterns in the data. So inherently, the machines are not meant for pattern processing, but we are evolving the algorithms in such a fashion that it helps us to process the patterns. So as we can figure out the intermediate two layers, what kind of features they would extract. Say, for instance, if it was letter A, then the corners and the junctions where these things join, the character joins, those are the important features to be extracted from character A. And those low-level features get integrated or assimilated in the next subsequent layer to form almost the shape of the very character that we are planning to recognize. So then almost at the end of that layer, you could see the characters or the patterns being formed. And now this in turn will drive one specific node in the output. So that triggering of one specific node, which will actually tells me what character has been recognized or what was the input pattern was all about. So this is how the neural network architecture more or less behaves. The lower layers with reference to CNNs extract lower level features, whereas when it comes to higher, deeper layers, they tend to extract the abstractness of a given input data. So it integrates all those lower level features and forms a broad level features. And those broad level features are the one which actually helps us to recognize or classify those different objects. That's how these CNNs work. So this was the kind of architecture that was proposed in NeoCognitron. Basically, it had two different layers, two different cells as far as these functions were concerned, and put those two cells form one layer of a given neural net. So here we can find the layers such as S cells and the C cells. S cells are meant to extract the low level features, and the C cells helps to integrate all that information and forms a high level feature. So there are several deeper layers that actually runs through these networks, and at the juncture of the last layer, which actually gives us the output itself of a given neural network. Then output is all governed by what we are intending to derive from this neural network. So for instance, this is how these hierarchical information processing happens from low level features to high level features. Now, if we want to relate that NeoCognitron, which was proposed in the year 1980s, to the newer architectures called as convolutional neural nets, broadly, we can relate these S cells to the feature extraction modules, which we tend to call them as convolutional layer. That in turn gets connected to the pooling layers or the C cells, which integrates the information that it has extracted from the feature extraction layer. Then subsequently it feeds input to next subsequent layers sitting through. So we can stack that many different layers to form a complex or a very deep convolutional neural net. So at the end of it is where the classification happens. So drawing a cue from this old architecture of 1980s, the newer architectures were derived, and still in principle, they have similar set of layers as far as convolutional neural network is concerned. So what essential features that we can think of? To begin with, let's take the face recognition problem. So I have several faces at hand, and I have to identify which person's face it is. So to begin with, as I said, it starts with the most fundamental level of feature called as edges. So edges can be of different orientations. That's what we saw in the cat's visual cortex as well. So those were the fundamental features through which the visual stimulus were given. So those are some of the most fundamental features to extract. Then combine those lower level features, we can form different objects in the face, like eyes, ears, nose. Those forms the next set of higher level features. Now combine all these different features like eyes, ear, nose, put them together, then that's where the complete face emerges at the deeper layers. And this in turn can help us classify the image belonging to one of the specific person. So this is called as the hierarchical feature extraction techniques. So that's what essentially the convolutional neural network uses. So coming to edge detections. So broadly speaking, if this is the kind of images, I've specifically taken this image to demonstrate how these edges gets extracted from the given image. Say for instance, we do have vertical edges and also horizontal edges in a given image. So we can apply different operators on this image in order to extract those edges. So then we can, once we extract those edges, those forms to be the most fundamental features that has been extracted from those images, and integrate the information from these edges. I can form different objects in those images. So for instance, in these images, the next level of objects that I can form is the doors, the window, or the zebra crossing on a road. So those are all the different objects that can be constructed out of these edges. So then integrate all of them. Then I can classify the image as whether it is a road, whether it is a building, or whether it is a commercial block. So all those different decisions can be taken, and that depends on the way we train the neural network. Now, how do we extract these edges? People who have been working on computer vision certainly has no issues to say how do we extract these edges. But for the benefit of people who have not worked on computer vision, may certainly would like to know how to extract these edges. Say, for instance, what do those edges are? What are those edges are? Edges are the sudden changes or the discontinuities that are there in the given images, and that should be significantly high enough. There should be a significantly high change from one pixel to another pixel, and such regions are called as edges. So in fact, those edges are the high information bearing components of a given image. That's where the information lies. We also, when we tend to look at the object, we highly rely on those edges to say what is that object is. Say, looking at laptop, I can make out it is a laptop because the inherent characteristics of those edges are embedded for that particular object. How will I be able to distinguish a table from a chair? So it's all about the edge-based processing, which actually tells me what those objects are, even before getting into the texture or color. So these are the fundamental features that I need to extract first. So when it comes to edges, there are different types of edges, again, in the given images. They could be horizontal, they could be vertical, they could be diagonal. So there are different types of edges. And what kind of application we can think of extracting these edges? One such trivial application is that I can sharpen the images. Sharpening essentially means enhancing those edges. So is one trivial application of these edge detection. Likewise, there are plenty of other applications as far as this edge detection is concerned. So how do we extract these edges? So there are several operators in the literature when it comes to extracting these edges, called as Privet operator, Sobel operator, Laplacian operator. There are different types of operators, and each of those operators have their own characteristics to recognize different types of edges. It again depends on what applications we are dealing with. So these were some of the conventional operators that the computer vision or image processing people were using. Now, using the similar concept, we can also extract the basic level features from those images using convolutional neural nets. Let's see, what do we mean by this convolution? In order to understand what is this convolution and how do we extract these edges, let's take one simple image of a dimension 6 cross 6. That means to say it has got horizontal pixels to be 6 and vertical pixels to be 6. So it's a 6 by 6 matrix. Now here in this case, like it's a 6 by 6 cross 1. That means it's a grayscale image. We are no more considering the color image. If it would have been a colored image, then 3 such matrices would have formed the colored image, that is RGB. So given by the dimension 6 cross 6 cross 3. Whereas now let's take the grayscale image to begin with, that is 6 cross 6 cross 1. So let's say this is one such typical image I have at hand, and how do I apply the edge detection onto this particular image? Let's see that. So usually it comes with the equation of the form f of x comma y convolved with g of x comma y. So then there are two summation blocks. Why two summation has come into picture? It's because we are dealing with the 2D data. Henceforth, there are 2 dimensions. two dimensions and two summations that are there in this equation. And each of them is governed by the XY coordinate. So that is N1 and N2. So the image can be regarded as a function of those XY coordinates. Likewise, there will be another filter mask or a filter kernel. So you can see all these terminologies in the literature. Let's regard it as a filter. Now, I want to convolve the filter to this image f of x comma y so that I get the edge detection as an outcome. So it's a filtering concept. So those who people know what is signal processing is can very much relate this equation to. So there's a shifting of the filter kernel mask that gets convolved with the image f of x comma y. So that's how the convolution happens. I'll depict you pictorially. So let's say the filter is all given by this mask, that is 3x3 mask, and it has got certain coefficients. And these coefficients are the one which actually governs what kind of edges comes out of these image. So let's apply this mask onto images, onto the image. So what do we mean by applying a mask? It's exactly the same equation what I showed you last slide. So take this mask, place it on this, compute the dot product. So what is dot product is? So multiply each of those pixels with the filter coefficients, sum all of them, and you get a summed result. Whatever be that summed result, place it in the output first pixel position. Then shift this mask by 1 pixel position by right horizontally. Then calculate a similar thing. We get an output. So likewise, I can calculate all the horizontal values. Then shift this mask vertically by 1 pixel. Shift it down and calculate all those values. We tend to get a 4x4 output. And this 4x4 output essentially would have given us the edge detection of a given image. So these are some of the preliminary basic level features that we can think of when it comes to convolution. So how does it helps us to extract those edges? Let's regard one simple image, and here there is an edge. So all white pixels, all gray or black pixels, this is where the edge is. Now let's take this type of mask, which essentially helps us to extract the vertical edges, perform the convolution operation. We get an output image of this shape. And this white strip basically tells me that there's an edge, and there's a vertical edge that is present at this XY coordinate. In fact, this will be a little thick as far as first level of gradient is concerned. Don't worry, that's a different concept altogether, and we don't have time to deal with all those things. So we get an edge basically. So this is how we tend to detect those edges. And similar masks can be applied on complex image as well, two-dimensional image as well, to extract those features. Now take this vertical mask and flip it or rotate it clockwise by 90 degrees, we get an horizontal mask. So likewise, we can generate diagonal masks, that is plus 45 degree, minus 45 degree. So if we enhance the size of these masks, we can also generate different angles of edges as well. So that's the beauty with which we can extract the edges of a given images. Now, one problem with the convolution is that it reduces the output size. As we noticed, the 6x6 image was reduced to 4x4 due to the convolution operation. So if at all we want to avoid the shrinking of the given image, we can always pad the zeros to the boundary of a given image, called as zero padding. So by padding zeros, I am not modifying the information in a given image. Rather, it will be more beneficial because we are not processing the edges when we apply the convolution. The boundaries are left out. So if at all we want to cover those boundaries, then essentially we have to pad those zeros to the boundary and then process it through the convolution. So that's how we do handle something called as padding. So this helps us to retain the size of the output image to be same as the input image. So to that extent. And apart, like it also helps us to process the boundary information. So typically there, and also I told you shifting of those masks. So the shifting of mask can happen by 1 pixel, or we can shift it by 2 pixels. So that is called as stride. So there is something called as padding. There is something called as convolution. There is something called as stride. So put all these 3 things. So here is the equation to calculate what would be the output image size once I convolve it. So if we look at that, this basically without padding, without when stride is equal to 1 and no padding, this is the size of the output image. Whereas when I do pad, so this would be the size of the given image. So typically the same size is maintained when we tend to pad, say, by factor 1. So then I can have different strides as well. Say for instance, stride of 1 do tend to maintain the size of the output image to be same as the input image. Whereas if we have a stride of 2, so almost like it decimates the size of the image by half whatever the input image be. So when it comes to colored image, it's RGB matrix, which is denoted by R, G, and B. So then I can have my filters applied onto all these 3 different matrices separately. So then add those 3 different, whatever the output I'll be getting, integrate them with reference to that index, and I get a matrix of size 4 cross 4. So this is with reference to applying 1 filter on a given RGB or a colored image. So this is how it happens. Apply that volume, convolve them, and add all of those corresponding indexes. Then we tend to get 1 output matrix of size 4 cross 4 here in this case. So likewise, there could be several such filters. It need not be limited by 1 filter. So here is 1 filter. Here I can have another filter. Likewise, you convolve this image, I get another output image. Then keep on stacking them together. So I get a volume of data rather than getting a 2-dimensional data. I get a volume of output. And what is that size of that volume is? The size of that volume depends on the equation, whatever we said with reference to height and width. Whereas as far as the volume or the depth is concerned, that depends on how many filters I can have in a given layer. That tells me the volume size. So the beauty of the neural network is such that it's not a linear operator. If it was linear, we would have not delved into deep learning at all. So once we tend to apply a non-linear function on that convolution operation, that's where the beauty of this deep learning emerges out. In a sense, we are able to solve complex data, as complex as speech, as complex as vision. We are getting solution because of that non-linear function post that linear operation, because convolution operation is a linear operation. So you keep on stacking many linear operators, we may not be able to handle that complex data. In fact, like again, combination of all linear layers will be again a linear layer only. So the beauty of the neural network lies in making it non-linear. So how do we make it non-linear? So perform all those convolution operation. We get 4 cross 4 operator. Then there is a bias component as well, which is a real value for each of that filter. So you get an output, pass it through a nonlinear activation function. Most likely people are using a ReLU activation function. What do we mean by ReLU? It is a rectified linear unit. So I'll show you what is that ReLU unit is. The outcome of this nonlinear activation function is also an output of a similar dimension, that is 4 cross 4, but the values would have mapped non-linearly. So what equation that goes into realizing this? Say for instance, I'm at first layer. For the first layer of weights to be tuned, so I feed the inputs from the previous layer. The previous layer of first layer is nothing but the 0. So perform that matrix operation over here. This is a column vector. A is a column vector, and W usually it will be a matrix. So perform that matrix multiplication operation, plus add that bias of this current layer. So we get a linear output. So that is regarded as Z raised to the subscript of 1, which indicates that it's a first layer. So take this output, pass it through a nonlinear activation function, that is the ReLU function, which is denoted by the symbol G. I get the output of this first layer, that is A of the first layer. Now note that like it's a vector, it's no more one single scalar value. So now this will become the input for the next layer. So that's how the layers are stacked one after the other. So as you make number of layers to be much larger, you can handle much complex problems. So the question is, do we always have to go with a large number of layers? The answer is no. So that depends on what kind of application you are dealing with. If the problem is quite simpler, you can live with less number of layers. If problems are quite complicated and you have enough data to deal with, then the literature suggests that you need to go for a large number of layers to solve the problem. So what is a rectified linear units is? So it goes by this function called as max of 0, x. So if we plot that function, this is how it looks. So beyond zero, it's all flat because those values are much smaller than 0. Henceforth, 0 would be the maximum in that case. And anything beyond 0, obviously these values will be much larger than 0. Henceforth, it forms a straight line. So this is how that rectified linear units looks like. And people have deduced a lot of advantages using this ReLU or other types of nonlinear activation functions like sigmoid, tanh, and so on. There are different types of activation functions. ReLU is by far the most mostly used nonlinear activation function as far as the CNNs are concerned. So now we have learned a convolution with reference to 2 dimension. We also know what do we mean by the volume of the data. So now let's stack different parameters to deduce a simple convolution network to begin with. So this could be one such layer which has got 39 cross 39 cross 3. Let's say that is the dimension of the input and the 3 matrices RGB that is being fed. So if I apply 10 such filters with the parameters like f equals 3, s equals 1, p equals 0, I get a volume of data of dimension 37 cross 37 cross 10. So likewise, then you apply 20 such different filters, you get this dimension. So then take it and apply 40 filters. So you get these many parameters. And unroll this volume to make it one-dimensional column vector. So how do I unroll it? So take 1 pixel, place it over here, move horizontally by next position, place it over here. So likewise, you end up with the row and shift to the, you end up with the last column, shift to the next row, similarly stack them all together, then go to the next filter. So do a similar stacking of it. So eventually the dimension 7 cross 7 cross 40, which turns out to be 1960 elements, has now become a one-dimensional column vector of type 1960. Then pass it through another nonlinear activation function called as softmax function. So wherein we can take certain decisions out of these softmax function and we get an output. It could be classification output or it could be any other applications we are deriving with these types of networks. So now let's see what is that softmax function is. The most likely, if not, the output layer will be used. Output nodes always consists of a softmax function. Ma'am, do I have some more time? Hello.
Yes, sir. We are left with 15 more minutes. We have. Sir.
Yeah, fine. Okay. So sorry, I had to rush through because I lost some time through. But nevertheless, I hope like you are getting the concepts, and always refer to the literature what I've projected in the first slide for deeper understanding of these things. So then at the last layer, let's say 1960 values, they're called as Logit's scores. then I need, say, let's say 2 different classes, say cat and dogs. That's what my intention is to classify. So then I'll have 2 softmax functions, and those 2 softmax functions is of the equation of this nature. It's exponential on top, and I'm normalizing with reference to some denominator value. Don't worry about this equation. Probably, possibly this equation helps us to convert those values to the form of a probability scores. So, and sum all of them together, it comes to a value of 1. So that's what this softmax function does. Henceforth, people extensively use this softmax function at the last output layer. So it converts it to probability values. And based on those probability values, I can say the input image belongs to one of these classes. So whichever gives me the highest probability value, I tend to classify the input image to that particular class. So that's what the advantage of using the softmax function. So then, apart from this convolutional layer, as we had seen in the neocognitron network architecture, we had S cells, which is similar to that of our convolutional layer. Apart, we also had something called as C cells, which are called as pooling layers. So broadly speaking, in the literature, we can find 2 types of poolings, that is max pooling and the average pooling. So even to be frank, average pooling are no more used in the modern day architectures because there are certain inherent advantages as far as the max pooling is concerned. And people saw that max pooling tend to give a better result over average pooling. Henceforth, all the modern convolutional neural net architectures, you can find the max pooling layer. So post that convolutional layer, get stacked the pooling layer, that is max pooling layer. So what do we mean by a max pool layer? So the entire 2-dimensional grid is further divided into regions. And each of those regions, I apply the max pool. So what do I mean by applying the max pool? Take this 2x2 region of this 4x4, then pick whatever the maximum value. Here in this case, it is 9. So place that 9 here. So likewise, here it is 2, here it is 5, here it is 3. So what essentially it has done is, it has reduced the dimension of 4x4 to a 2x2 matrix. How we were able to do? We were able to do it by applying the max pool. The idea is that it essentially tries to extract the information that is quite critical to classification or quite critical to do with some applications. So that's the very idea or the on which like they apply these pooling layers, and people have noticed that these pooling layers gives us a good results. Henceforth, they'll be using it. But there's no strong theoretical justification of why this pooling has to work in the literature. Nevertheless, they've been working good, and we've been using in convolutional neural nets. So now we can think the convolutional neural network as a stack of layers. For instance, convolutional layer always is combined with the pooling layer, and those two put together forms one layer of the convolutional neural network. So likewise, I can have several such layers in the convolutional neural network. As we saw in one of the slides, we are in the year 2015, they had used 156 different such layers. So such is the complexity of the convolutional neural nets they've been using. Then at last, always lies the fully connected layer, which essentially helps us to classify the feature that has been extracted by these convolutional layers. And what kind of features that we are able to extract? It is the hierarchical features. For instance, here in this case, layer 1, if it helps us to extract the basic level of features like edges and so on, the next level of features uses these edges and integrate that information to form next subsequent higher level features. And at last, like almost the abstractness of the given information is constructed at the deepest most layer. So that in turn is converted to a one-dimensional stack, as we saw. How do we do that? So that in turn is all fed to a number of hidden layers in the fully connected network. Then essentially it goes to the softmax function for the classification purpose. So this is how the convolutional neural network works. And essentially what parameters that we need to tune, it is the weights of these masks or the filters that needs to be tuned. Unlike in the conventional sense, where we used to fix the coefficients of the filters, here those coefficients have to be fixed based on some notion of feedback. So that feedback happens through a backpropagation algorithm. So that backpropagation usually works with reference to the change of value. That is, first we need to calculate the difference between the predicted result and the desired result. The difference of those two forms the error of the given network. So based on that error, I fine tune these weights. So there are different types of errors people do adopt. Say, for instance, mean square error is one of the most fundamental ways of calculating the error. That is, take the output, the actual output, what I've derived from the network. So take the actual output, or which is obtained from the labels. So most likely we're talking about the supervised techniques. Henceforth, the training data will have labels. So calculate the difference and square them together, take the mean of it, that becomes the mean square error. That's one of the most fundamental ways of calculating the error. But of course, there are, this basically converts the problem into a convex optimization problem. Then we can always apply the gradient descent algorithm on top of this convex optimization in order to arrive at the optimal solution. That is, by changing the weights adaptively, I get the optimal solution. So that's by determining where the slope is almost zero. So that's the point, like what we are interested in. But seldom we do get this parabolic convex optimization issues when we deal with the complex data as we are dealing with the deep learning. So the loss function will not be a simple parabolic curve, but it's quite complicated than that. So we'll have a local minimas and local maximas as far as those error or loss function is concerned. In order to solve that, this simple mean square error may not be the right tool. So henceforth, there are other ways of calculating the errors, like logistic regression, cross entropy functions, then other types of loss functions as well do exist. So which I'll not get into all those things. So using those functions, then again, I can apply simple gradient techniques. And there are enhanced versions of those simple gradient techniques, like stochastic gradient descent techniques, SGD with momentum. Then we have Adam optimizer. We have RMS prop optimizers. So there are different types of optimizers. The job of those optimizers is to find the global minima. So it's and is it guaranteed that always I'll get into the global minima? Nobody on this earth can guarantee you that we'll get into global minima. But as long as it's sufficient enough to cater to my application, I can live with those optimal points. So that's the way we can fine tune those weights. The fundamental principle that lies to adapt these weights lies in the simple chain rule of partial differentiation, through which, like, we do fine tune the parameters, and we reach a converging point, and that's when we say the convolutional neural net has been trained. So then came different standard architectures that are available, like ELINet 5. It has got 5 different layers. The parameters are given like this. Then AlexNet, which is of this structure. Then VGG16, VGG19. So as you see, the literature is progressing. The number of hyperparameters to be tuned and the number of deeper layers that these networks can handle is increasing significantly, thanks to the computational ability that is there at our disposal. Then apart, like, there is also good improvement as far as literature and software is concerned. I mean, to be frank, there's no big improvement as far as the literature, starting from ELINet. The fundamental principle is all same, apart from adding more number of layers and stacking them together. There's no big improvement as far as the algorithm itself is concerned. So the next big challenge would be to reduce the number of layers and still attain the same kind of result. lessen the number of parameters, lessen the data, so still can we attain the same performance. So that's one of the biggest challenges we have as a research community. So now, fine, I mean, we got to know some theoretical aspect of it, but how do we realize, how do we start? So this is one of the biggest problems we academicians have. We never try hands-on. Once we know the theory, we have to apply those theory onto practice. So how do we bring this to practice? Now, as I told, the tools are excellent, and it's very easy to try out these algorithms on different data sets. So one such data set to begin with is called as MNIST database. So it's a simple data set of handwritten characters and individual digits, for instance, 0 to 9 digits. So such 60,000 images have been categorized as the training set, and some 10,000 images have been categorized as the test set. And it's a very small data, 28 cross 28 pixels. And we don't even need a GPU-based machine to run these kind of data. We can run in any ordinary laptop or a desktop system. And it pretty much does the same job like as we run on GPU. There's no GPU that is necessary in this case. Yeah. So then essentially the objective is to classify the digit. So given a new test data, new test image, the algorithm has to tell like what digit it is. So that's the objective of this particular thing. So the Keras is one of the simple set of libraries through which like we can start our coding, and it's very simple to realize. That's the reason why people prefer Keras to begin with. These are some of the tools that we essentially need. That is, we need to install Anaconda. We need to install. Hello. You're able to listen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Sir. So install Anaconda. Install Keras. Then like let me just show you that. So this is the MNIST data set like that we were talking about. Yeah, then we need to normalize the data. Normalization of image is nothing but divide the image pixels by 255, because 255 is the maximum value grayscale can take, assuming that it's an 8-bit quantization. So then the width of the data, and we need to do one-hot encoding. Don't worry about that one-hot encoding. Basically, it takes the matrix and puts the label in a one-hot encoded form. So don't worry about that. So then let's start with a fully connected layer, a simple shallow network to begin with. This is how the Keras can be written. So include all the essential libraries. The beginning set of lines essentially includes all the set of libraries that is needed to build this program. Then reshape the data. So that is 28 cross 28 pixels. Arrange them in the one-dimensional column vector shape. Convert them into a floating point data. Normalize the data by dividing it with the maximum value. So then separate the train and test data, convert it into a one-hot encoding state. Don't worry, you'll get to know. If you browse a little, you'll get to know what is one-hot encoding is. So then form a network in a sequential fashion. So include one dense layer, which is the hidden layer of dimension 100 here. So this is 100, and input shape is all 784. That's the one column vector that we are feeding with. And the activation function, which I've included, is ReLU, but you can always change and see like what impact it has on the network. And the last layer, I have 10 nodes. Why? Because I have got 10 different objects to be classified. That is 0 to 9 characters. Then activation function is the softmax function. So then comes the loss function. Here I've used the cross entropy loss function. So then I've used Adam optimizer. Most likely this is the optimizer people prefer when it comes to classification objective. So then run that, you get certain accuracy, which is not so great. Whereas now, once we build the convolutional neural net, it's again the same step as we had followed in the earlier thing. Only thing is the network architecture changes. Here, I'm introducing the convolutional 2D of size 25, and the kernel size is 3 cross 3. Stride, I'm following it to be 1. Padding, I'm padding it, and the activation function I'm considering is ReLU. So then I have included the max pool layer, then flatten it, connect it to a dense network, one hidden layer in this case. So then 10 output nodes in the softmax layer. So then again, cross entropy, then Adam optimizer is what I'm using. So if I run this, this is typically as I run through different batches and epochs. Don't worry about like those batches and epochs. Certainly, once you delve into the architecture, you get to know what is those, what are those batch size and what should be those epochs are. So as the steps increases, we can notice that accuracy, the validation, and the accuracy of the system is increasing. So you reach a point where there will be no further improvement. You can stop at that point. So this is how we typically build a neural network as far as a convolutional neural net is concerned. In fact, like you people may go through the backpropagation literature as far as this CNN is concerned. I have a very good link which is neatly deduced mathematically. I'll pass it to the organizers. They in turn will pass that link to you all. So always you can go through that to understand the theory behind this convolutional neural net. So with that, I'll stop at this point. Hope I've justified to make you understand the conceptual blocks that are there in the convolutional neural net to almost one step behind the implementation. So I've showed you the code, and also I've given you the necessary links. Always you can do your homework to get to know what is convolutional neural net is all about. With that, I can take 1 or 2 questions if you have any quickly. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Really, it was an exceptional session, actually. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and giving the deep understanding on this topic. So we have few questions, actually. Can I?
Yeah, please, ma'am. Yeah. Please.
From Professor Sumedha, how CNN is used for 3D modeling of object?
Yeah. So again, see, the input layer, we converted 2-dimensional data to 1-dimensional column vector. So likewise, if we have a 3-dimensional data, so when we say 3-dimension, it's of 2 types. One is, of course, X and Y coordinates forms a 2-dimension. The third dimension would be time when it comes to video data. So again, we can treat them as individual frames and process it, as long as we don't want the relation to be utilized from one frame to another frame. We can treat them as individual discrete frames. Another type of 3-dimensional data is that we have a z-axis to a given xy dimension, so which gives the depth information. So again, we can take the 3-dimension and convert it to a single-dimensional column vector. And then all these, the same network architecture can be utilized to handle 3-dimensional data as well. Hope I've answered that question, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. A question from Professor Jyoti. What ideal size of filter can be considered during medical image processing?
Ma'am, most likely in the literature, what I've noticed is 3 cross 3, because going anything beyond this 3 cross 3 will increase the computational complexity of the network. But if you have a good computational capability, and if you're not targeting a real-time application, then you can afford to go for higher sizes of the filter mask or kernel. People use 5 cross 5, mostly it will be odd numbers, 5 cross 5, 7 cross 7, 9 cross 9. So such is the size of the masks. And apart from this normal convolution, there are other types of convolutions which literature uses, like dilation convolutional networks are there. Dilation convolution is there. So you can try with other types of convolutions as well. What I've showed you is a very simple, basic architecture to begin with. Hope I've answered that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. One more question from Swapnil.
Mhm.
What are the methods to choose the bias and decide the weights?
No, there are no methods to decide the bias. Always there is a bias in the given network. Even bias also gets adapted when we back propagate through each of those layers. Uh, even they get updated. Bias also gets updated.
So one last question by Professor Devika. The size of
Mhm.
the filter and stages should be same in descending order, or it can be in ascending also.
There is no such hard and fast rule that the size, at least for a given layer, the size should be same because else it becomes really cumbersome to adjust these weights. At least for a given layer, the size and should be same, but across the layers they could be of different sizes. There's no hard and fast rule that they should be same.
Thank you, sir. Can you take one last question, sir? We have one more question.
Yeah, please, ma'am.
So
Please.
how can we use CNN in document image processing? Documents like in English and Arabic language.
Yeah, so there, see, one is that when it comes to written characters, whatever I demonstrated, it's a single character. Uh, and CNNs are really good at handling these independent data. Whereas when it comes to handwritten documents, right, there comes the notion of connectivity. That is, one character is connected to the next character to form the words. And words inherently cannot be handled so nicely using convolutional neural net. Why? Because they're sequential patterns. The kind of networks which are useful to handle these sequential data are the LSTMs, long short-term memory networks, then time delay neural nets, recurrent neural nets. So those are good networks to handle such kind of sequential data rather than these discrete convolutional neural nets.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your precious time and sharing the knowledge with us, sir. Thank you, sir. I think all the questions has been answered.
Thank you for the organizers, especially Rupa ma'am and Harish sir, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and interact with you people. Unfortunate part is we are not there face to face. Nevertheless, it has avoided me traveling all the way to Mysore and so on. So this online mode is the norm of a day. Hopefully this has conveyed the right info and has motivated few of you at least to take up this area of research. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
Dear participants, we'll have the next session at 2:30, and the link will be shared by 2 o'clock. Now we'll break for the lunch, and the session start exactly at 2:30. The link will be shared by 2 o'clock, and few were asking about the slides and the presentation. Yes, once the sir sends the presentation, we'll share with you one thing. And the next thing, the recording. Yes, recording has been done of all the videos. That URL will be shared with you guys. These are the few questions which we asked for the organizers. Sharing of the link. Yes, it will be done. As slides, we have asked for the slide.